Where I live, there are many machines. In fact, I am surrounded by them. One might say, I'm floating in an ocean of machines. And it's obvious, and long been obvious to me, I think even since I was a child, that as exciting as machines can be, we're competing against them for human attention, for ecological survivability. We're competing against them in 10 new ways each day that we can't compete in. They're made of parts, machines, and they're made by humans for purposes. And as we could see even with an automobile, like the ones you can hear right now, they intrude everywhere, even here, now, in an intimate moment between us. And their intrusion is noisome. They don't make the intelligent music of living beings, which, if you listen to this recording very carefully, you may hear in the background, along perhaps with the sound of the breeze through the living leaves of trees. These are not made of parts. They are not made for purposes. And evolution is not a purpose, but a process. A process we understand less than 1/100th of 1% of. I think a lot about the polarity, a polarity in seeing that places precedence on parts, functions, purposes. But there are no parts in nature. And honestly, the idea of functions is a fiction. It's a verbal fiction. It's a conceptual fiction. It's a prosthesis, one way of seeing. That way is a tool-like way and is useful for tool-like purposes. But we do not wish our minds to become tool-like, nor our cultures, bodies, dreams, humanity, planet, future. If you've ever tried to live instead of in a home, say in an auto garage, then you'd understand immediately that this place is unlike your organism in a way that is lethal. But there's some very interesting things about the mind that sees parts and the difference between giving this aspect of consciousness or attention precedence and the mind that relates with wholes or gestalts, unities. And almost all of our culture is focused on part mind and driven by part mind. In other words, it's driven by fictions. Fictions of mechanism, function, fictions of value. But there are some really interesting things that we can immediately see about this mode of thinking. One is that it's utilitarian, right? It's something we do for very specific purposes. Often these purposes are multiple and parts of them are hidden from us, so that We think the purpose of an automobile is to provide, for example, convenient travel opportunities. In fact, it has some 100 purposes. Some 90 of them we don't discuss and are mostly hidden to us and are deadly. And we tend to discuss the ones that we superficially like, or identify with, or want to identify with, ignoring those we do not wish to notice or identify with. In other words, we ignore that which we do not wish to see as like ourselves, in this case. But there's something kind of simple about parts that's really important to understand. Parts could be understood as as a second-order phenomenon, and origins and gestalts as a first-order phenomenon. These are entirely different orders of seeing, thinking, meaning, identity, and value. And the second-order phenomenon is the result of activities in the first. So it will never leap above the first and say, I stand over you, or I generate you. And this can be expressed in an analogy. A memory you have will never be your memory. In other words, the product of one of your faculties will not be the faculty. Similarly, a machine will never be a mind. It's absolutely impossible. They're different orders of reality, entirely different order. A machine is a bit like language in the sense that it's a second-order product of mind. So that product is, no matter how sophisticated you want to make it, is not going to ever become a first-order phenomenon. The parts don't become gestalts. And the machine is a false gestalt. It's not really a unity at all. It's actually just a conglomeration of parts. Its unity is not in the machine, but in our thinking, whereas organisms, the unity is in being. It's absolutely true, authentic, verifiable, veritable, trustworthy, in every single way of seeing living things and places. There's no exception. But there's another interesting thing about parts, and analogies can help us to see how important it is. Or rather, seeing with the parts-oriented mind in Precedence, which is how we're trained. And it can be very, it's almost impossible to evade this, actually. One has to have some kind of transformative experience of realization to suddenly understand that we've had the wrong end of the structure, the tiny end, the function-oriented end. But in any case, if you were to, for example, let's say that you were an amorphous intelligent life form. So you're something like a great big amoeba, and you're very intelligent, and you've seen lots of amorphous life forms on your world, but you don't have any formed life forms. And so if you were to find a hand, right, which is a part of a human body, you could even find a hand that had just been severed from a human body. And of course, you've never seen anything like this because all of your biology is amorphous. It's blobby, right? It doesn't really have parts. It's just flowing unities and things like that, and constellations of them. So if you were to if a creature like this were to find a hand, there'd be absolutely no way for them to tell what it indicated. In other words, there's no way that the hand would, for example, indicate the existence associated with that part of the second-order phenomenon, of the first-order phenomenon of seeing. From a hand, you would not imagine eyes, ears, mouths, taste, smell, hearing, speech, minds. There's nothing in the hand that would lead you to suspect the existence of these actually very obvious true things. You cannot really tell the nature of the whole simply by looking at a part. And similarly, they could such a creature, the amorphous creature, could examine the cellular structure of a hand, perhaps even the genetic structure, and it would never indicate anything like a mind or soul, the intellect, the self, emotions, right? There's no part of your body you could look at that would hint at the first order phenomenon of being, seeing, knowing, understanding, feeling, relating. This is nowhere indicated in the parts, and you can't make a conglomeration of parts that has properties like this. It is not made. It is not a product. Wholes emerge fully as unities from other wholes in nature, and precedence in nature is everywhere on unity, on the first order phenomenon. And this is an astonishing recognition that our ideas about gestalts have been damaged in some way by our relationship with language and machines, such that in coming to see and understand machines as gestalts, we made the mistake of believing that things are collections of parts. And honestly, especially if you look at the human body, if you've ever studied biology, you'll very immediately realize that there aren't any obvious parts. It's a big ocean where everything's touching, all the substances are alive, all the contexts are living. It's completely unified from beginning to end. There's no... The things that we call parts are conveniences of language derived from the purposes of science and medicine. Noble purposes they may be, but their projections on identity are fundamentally the opposite of reality. I was once with a group of philosophers, and I tried to express my disdain for the idea that we are in some way mechanical. And one of them said, well, how are we different? And I said, machines are assembled by people from parts for purposes. That's what mechanism is about. Now, there's another definition of mechanism, right? We can use the word abstractly to say, for example, talk about aspects of a process that we have some formal understanding of, formal model of, theories, equations, testable, rational material and such. That stuff is true in its narrow domain of concern, and given the, how should we put it? Given the dangers of abstraction from being to theory, from experience and understanding to language and structure, we should realize, obviously, that the result, however indicative of true features, reliable features of common experience, is woefully incomplete because it is a description. And there are fundamentally sort of two kinds of knowledge. There's knowledge by direct experience, familiarity, and knowledge by description. Obviously, these are not the same thing. Machines are much like the second thing. They are embodiments of descriptions of processes. There is no organism like that. But we can say that, we can use the term mechanism to describe our intellectual purchase on processes. We just shouldn't confuse that with those processes actually being mechanical in nature. For most of these processes, their mechanicalness is not in them, but rather in our approach and its orientations, habits, expectations, purposes, the necessities of formal analysis, things like this. We're going to throw away more than 99% of the phenomenon, and what we'll be left with is a peculiarly articulate remnant. But that is never the phenomenon. There's an excellent example of this for most of medical history up until now, or up until perhaps 5 years ago. Medical science explicitly denied the meaningful presence of 90% of the cells in our body. When you heard the phrase, or you hear even today, if you hear the phrase your DNA, they're not talking about your DNA. They're talking about the DNA in the animal cells of your body. Now, granted, that's the germline that you get from your parents and all of that. But 90% of our cells by number that we acquire after birth, which we acquire from the environment, are not human cells. 90% of them. And in case it's not clear, it's pretty obvious that the 10% is floating in the other 90%, and that these two are intimately relational, so that what we call now the commensal microbiota, the lost 90% of us, is obviously influencing the development and activity of the genes in the other 10%, meaning there's a non-germline transport for traits. Science is essentially unaware of this, and for most of medical history, it's been considered, and it still is today, fairly excellent medical practice to simply wipe out as much of those and change forever by poisoning the 90% of those other cells that we don't really care about. So you can see how the incredible narrowness of focus is very, very dangerous as relates to organisms. It tends to notice what it wants to see. It tends to notice its own projection likeness of what it's looking for, and exclude almost everything else, which usually is most of reality. Well, organisms are never like that. They're nothing like that. They're not parts, they're not individuals. You and I are individuals only as a fiction of language, and it's a wild fiction. Neither are we explicitly all one. Right? The ways in which unity exists and constellates other unities are quite profound, but they're not simple. They're not simply, oh yeah man, it's all one, dude. No, it's not like that. Unity has precedence, though, especially in living systems, and I will suggest in intelligent minds. Intelligent minds can see, have preserved the polarities in their proper order, and can distinguish between the features of employing them, right? So intelligent minds learn that what we see when we go looking for parts is extremely deceptive, and they learn to look with the other eye that sees unities first. This eye would count the hand very differently from us. It might count it as +7 rather than 5. Notice that our count of 5 counts only the extensions and pretends they're individual. But there's nothing in your hand that's separate. And, like your body, your hand has a central body of unity, which we don't count. Isn't that funny? We don't count the place where the members come together. But the mind of unity would count that first. In fact, placing precedence on unity, we would first count the hand as one. We would notice that it's a unity. And then we might notice that it has a unifying body, and that it has members that are connected and related through this body. And that this body magnifies provocatively the powers and potentials of each member. almost infinitely, especially when as relates to the human hand. Think about it. But they would also notice the wrist that leads upscale to a very similarly oriented structure. One unifying body, 4 working members, each with 3 segments, 1 thinking member with 2 segments. It's the same frame paradigm as the hand, at another order. And at that other order, lo and behold, we find eyes, a mind, a mouth, taste, speech, hearing, smell, wonder, awe, intelligence. None of these would we guess from looking at the structure of the hand. No amount of analysis would ever lead us to suppose this. Most of what we really hope to learn and see has to do with first order phenomenon, not with the second order phenomenon that we're constantly sort of fascinated by. We want direct experiences of intelligence, of being, of new ways of seeing, perhaps of vision itself, of divinity, of insight. And it is our nature to seek these together. But our wings have largely been clipped. And to return them to their necessary splendor, we need to learn to invert and deny some of the results of our habitual approach to identity, what things are. What they are is something we mostly decide during our approach, rather than something we discover innately existing outside of that approach. So intelligence must become a way of using that first order understanding to produce vastly superior second order products in thought, conception, language, idea, and model. Our cultures are really damaged by the idea of the individual, and we seem to think that there's only 2 options, right? There's either everybody's individuals, and you have preserve individual rights and freedoms, which of course are fictions and don't exist, especially when we try to preserve them. Once you have to preserve them, you're already in big trouble. But neither is the answer perfect unity, like a communist kind of thing. Like, both of these answers are completely wrong. They're both abstract extremes. Neither of them will fulfill our human hopes or natures, and both of them are likely to assault them, corrupt them, damage them, repurpose them. No, we don't need any explicit overriding hierarchy. We need something like the capacity to form and correct small, intelligent unities and to constellate them socially. But the whole idea of the individual and the collective is very, very confused in our modern cultures. And it seems to be based on parts, functions. And unlike machines, when humans make the collection analog, right, when they come together and do things together, functions, when they function together, unlike machines, what the humans are doing is duplicitous. So that you don't have a politician who's actually a good politician. And if you had like a car that just didn't work and did every other thing but roll down the street, you'd immediately know that's not a car. But in our cultures, you don't. In our cultures, you can actually have the opposite of a politician as a politician, and the opposite of a protector as a protector. The opposite of a doctor as a doctor. The opposite of a teacher as a teacher. The opposite of an advocate as a lawyer. the opposite of justice as a courtroom, the opposite of democracy as America. Because when the basis of our purposes and relations are duplicitous and involve things like profit, the aggrandizement of an individual, and things like that, the outcomes are deadly, and they have to be. To preserve that process, these outcomes must remain toxic and deadly. So if we are to change our cultures and to affect them at any level at all, if we are to learn how to authentically educate our children and each other rather than produce damaged replicas of relatively insane ideas, we will need to see how to make true our purposes and unify them. If our purposes are truly with and for each other, we're in pretty good terrain to start with. That's a simple enough beginning. But if they're for ideas about individuals and rights and aggrandizement and profit and commerce and economy and war, well, we're going to be a different kind of animal. And that animal, as we can see from history, is neither human nor intelligent. It does not relate with unities. It breaks them into parts for purposes and prosecutes the remnant. So let us turn back to the other way. And this is the way ineffectively pointed toward by philosophy, true science, and anything that might be worthy of being called the pursuit of the divine, or the instancing of it. Let us rediscover the aspects of our intelligence that place precedence on unity together, and we can do this very rapidly with analogies and toys of seeing that lift us briefly out of the cages we've long struggled within, confused, alone often, in many cases helpless, and yet urgently enthralled with the grand beauty of living beings, the promise of our human birth, and the memory of all the living places and minds upon which this moment of our being and hope, our fascination, our wonder, and our awe are founded. Let's not have the coda we've had here, where at the end, machines have the final say.